Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Happier HR. I'm so glad we have another week and another call so we can share our thoughts on navigating the holidays with family. This is a topic that is pretty relevant as we go through many different holidays this season. But I think it's also important because many of us, don't want to talk about it, although we may not want to be celebrate the holidays with family. But also, some of us actually go through grief to this time, and we prefer not to be with some of our family members. So I think it's a relevant and important topic. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share my slides here. And let me make sure I'm doing this correctly. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you guys can see my slides. Yeah, hopefully you guys can see my slides. Okay, so again, the topic for today is navigating the holidays with family. So what I want to talk to you about first is what I see the problem being when we're having to gather with family over the holidays. The second thing I want to talk to you guys about is manuals and boundaries, and I will define those two. I think you're very familiar with boundaries, although the way I approach it might be a little bit different, and then manuals might be a new concept. And third, I want to talk to you about how can you actually enjoy the holidays with family. So before we get started, I want you to think about which one word describes holidays for you. When I say holidays, what comes to mind? And I want you to jot it down if you can. Then I want you to think about when I say family, what word actually comes to mind? And last but not least, I want you to think about when I say holidays with family, what word comes to mind? And I can tell you for me, when I think about holidays, I love the holidays. I do. We celebrate Christmas here. We decorate. I love all of that. That comes with it. I love the food too. Yes. Now, when I think about family, I love my family. And I think about it in a joyful way. However, when I think about holidays with family, that's when it gets a little stressful for me. That's how I feel. I feel very stressful having all these people together under one roof celebrating the holidays. Okay? So think about what those three words are for you. Okay. So one of the things I think that creates stress for many of us during the holidays is there's certain situations that we don't like being part of, especially if we're celebrating with a lot of people, right? And I think some of those people might be our family members. And it's, nobody wants to talk about that. But in reality, it is true. We don't like every single family member in our family. And that it's okay, right? That is very human. We're all very different, right? Our values are different. The things we speak are different. So that tends to clash with people. And then we also have unrealistic expectations. And when I talk about unrealistic expectations, I will go a little deeper in the next slide. But it's not just you, it's everyone you're going to be meeting with. They all have their own expectations as to how, the lunch or the dinner should go, or how should we celebrate, whatever holiday you celebrate, right? So I think the holidays is the perfect, it's a perfect storm to bring all those elements together. You have the actual celebration, and there's certain rituals, I'm going to call those things that we like to do under those holidays. And then there's the people that get together, and then all the expectations that every single person that's attending has. So that is kind of the perfect storm to make the holidays a bit difficult to celebrate with family members. Now, I told you guys I was going to talk about unrealistic expectations, and this is what I'm going to call the manual. And I think this is part of the problem, right? Again, it's just everyone thinks things should go a certain way. And we tend as human beings not to enjoy being around people that differ or don't comply to what we think, should be happening. And that's what I'm going to call again is the manual. And a manual is simply an instruction manual, literally. It's not written, but it's all in our head as to how people should behave or should not, and what people should say or should not, or should do or should not. And I highlight the word should because every time you hear yourself shoulding, whether it's at yourself or other people, that's a manual you have. Okay. And if you get anything out of this, is that every time you use the word should, you're thinking that things should go or should be happening in a way that they're not. Okay. We have manuals for people, but we also have manuals for situations. Again, with the holidays, every family has the way of celebrating, for example, Christmas, which is what I celebrate, right? Every family has their own way of doing it. But when you go to a different family to celebrate it with, you may be like, oh, that's interesting. I don't think it should be done that way. Same thing with the food. I mean, it could be with things. I don't think she should cook the turkey that way, right? It's all those things that we have judgment as to how things should be done or should not be done. But I also want to say that we have models for ourselves, okay? And I know most of us don't think that that's the case, but it is. Every time you find yourself saying, I should do or I should not, that is your manual right there. So catch yourself, right? And I think the most important thing to understand when there's a manual, there's only one person in the world that you can control, and that is yourself. Even for us that have kids, I wish I could control my kids sometimes, right? You can only control yourself. And if you remember what we were talking about last week, there's circumstances that happen in the world and there's people you have no control over, none whatsoever. You can only control yourself. The other thing I want to talk about is boundaries. And I think all of us have a definition of a boundary. We kind of understand it, but I think we misunderstand part of what the boundary is. So a boundary will delineate where the behavior of one person ends and the other one starts. That's the way I kind of see it. But what I think where we get confused is the boundary is not on somebody else. The boundary is not meant to control other people. She's so hard to understand and not do, right? The boundary is actually for yourself. And what the boundary does, it will delineate acceptable behavior to you. And when a person crosses that line of what is acceptable to you, then a boundary violation has occurred. That person is almost like, imagine a fence around your house and your neighbor crosses over that fence without permission, they just violated that boundary. Well, the same thing happened with behavior. Okay. So how do you set boundaries? The way you set boundaries, and I have it here, is you say, if you do X, Y, Z, then I will do A, B, C. Okay. And I'm going to give you an example. For example, if you continue raising your voice, I will leave the room and the conversation ends. Okay. But you can set boundaries again in so many different ways. I think what is very, very important about the boundaries is that once you set it, you have to follow through on what you say you were going to do, on the consequence. Otherwise, there's no boundary. If you allow your neighbor to cross over all the time, that boundary doesn't exist anymore for that neighbor. Or for you, by the way, right? So it is important that you follow through, and it is the hardest part of the boundary is to follow through. Because as humans, we tend to think about the other person and how they feel and what will happen and all of that, right? But the moment you establish a boundary and follow through on it, and believe me, because I've done this, as hard as it is in the moment, then you actually feel proud of yourself because you said you were going to do something if a behavior continued and you did it. And that shows the other person, oh my God, this is for real. Okay. Okay. So let's talk about the holidays now. So let's say you have a celebration coming up. So there are a couple of steps I want you to take before that event happens. And the first is I want you to become aware of your manuals. And how you do that, I want you to start thinking about the event that's coming up and everything that comes up for you, emotionally and in your brain as well, in your mind. Because whatever comes to mind is the manual you have. Okay. Then I want you to decide to think an intentional thought. And what that means is is a thought that I want you to pick and say, okay, this is what I'm going to think when this happens. Okay. One of the things that I can share with you, I don't barely drink now. And when there's a lot of drinking happening around me, I can see my brain go to that should not be the case, right? So one of the things that I tried to think is like, you got to let others be. That's my thought, right? Got to let others be. And usually when you have that thought, then a lot of the tension that I feel goes away. So you have to pick a thought that will help you kind of come back to center, neutralize yourself so that you can actually keep enjoying the event. Okay, so I want you to decide on that intentional thought, and then I want you to practice it. And practice it every time the gathering comes to mind. As you get closer to today, I want you to practice going back to that thought. Okay, and last but not least, I want you to set boundaries. If this happens, this is what I will do. Okay. One of the things I want to say about boundary that I forgot is you can tell the person, your boundary for sure, so that you can have that communication, actually do that, for example, with my husband, right? I'm like, okay, these are going to be the boundaries, but you don't have to. You don't necessarily have to communicate it in order for you to act on the consequence. If it happens, what I would recommend is at that moment when it's happening, then you say it and you take action on the consequence. Okay. So before the gathering, I think the most important thing is self-awareness of your manuals and then setting up those boundaries. Now, once you're there at the event, then you have to become aware of any manual language that comes up for you. And these are going to be your shoulds and your shouldn'ts, your have and have nots, or your need to. Okay, those are kind of keywords when you're thinking about manuals. Those words come up, there's a manual running in the background. Okay, so become aware. Then when you catch yourself with that language, then I want you to repeat the intentional thought that you have pre-selected. Repeat it in your mind and repeat it as often as possible and as often as needed. I can tell you guys in the beginning when I was doing this work, I was repeating my intentional thought for 3 hours straight, right? But it will calm me down. Okay. Number 3 is you have to expect, I call it the unexpected, but it's really unexpected. I mean, think about it. Is it really that unexpected that that person is actually going to act that way? They've been doing it for 5 years. Every time you have a holiday gathering, they do it. So it's not really unexpected, but just expect that that will happen again. And again, another great thought for me is like, of course, I knew that was going to happen, right? And last but not least is follow through on the boundary. If the violation occurs, you need to follow through on the boundary. Okay, last but not least, what you need to remember is you can only control yourself. So you do you, and then you let others be who they are. Okay. So cheerful holidays with the family are possible. You just have to be self-aware. Those manuals, you have to let them go as much as you can and just set and follow through on boundaries. Okay. Those are the 3 key ingredients to enjoy a cheerful holiday with family. Okay, so we're going to go now to the conversation part of our call. Thank you for being here, and I'm going to turn up the recording now so we can have that conversation. And I will see you guys next Friday, again, at noon. I can't remember what next Friday is. But anyways, next Friday we'll be here with another topic in the Happy Hour. Have a good day.